There is a photograph of Derek Redmond that the world remembers. A runner, bent almost double, one leg barely carrying him, his face twisted in pain. And beside him, his father, one arm around his son. Together, they move toward the finish line. It is one of the most recognizable images in Olympic history. And for years, the story seemed obvious. A man fell. His father came down from the stands. They finished together. A beautiful story about courage. But that isn't the story we're here to tell. Because the finish line wasn't the end of Derek Redmond's story. It was the moment the life he had spent years building began to disappear. Derek had spent years becoming a 400-meter runner, an elite athlete. He had already won major international honors and established himself among Britain's best 400-meter runners. He had already experienced what it felt like to have that future taken away once. In 1988, Derek's first Olympic dream ended before it had really begun. An Achilles injury forced him out of the Seoul Games. He watched the Olympics continue without him. And later, during the closing ceremony, he found himself alone in his hotel room, feeling as though he had never really belonged there. 4 years later, Barcelona offered him another chance. Barcelona was supposed to be different. Derek arrived at the team's base a week before the other athletes. He wanted time to settle in. He arranged the hotel room so the noise stayed at one end and he could have some quiet at the other. He had learned from Seoul that the little things mattered. And this time, he felt good. In his heat, he ran 45 seconds dead. He later remembered it as one of the easiest races he'd ever run. He wasn't dreaming about simply making the final. He believed he was running for a medal. There was one warning. His hamstrings felt a little tight, but nothing that seemed unusual. Sprinters get used to running through discomfort. So Derek ran. He got out of the blocks well. Then, about 150 meters into the semifinal, Derek felt as though he had been shot in the back of the leg. His hamstring tore. He collapsed. The race was over. Medical staff came toward him with a stretcher. Derek pulled himself up. At first, he honestly thought he could still catch the others and make the final. But he could barely walk. And by then, he no longer wanted the stretcher. He wanted to finish the race. Derek began to hop toward the finish. He had already decided he was going to keep going. Then, coming around the final curve, he saw someone running toward him. His father. Jim Redmond had been watching from the stands. He had no accreditation. He had only a ticket. But when he saw his son on the track, he made his way past security and onto the field. When Jim reached him, Derek broke down in tears. His father put an arm around his shoulder and told him to keep going. Derek's father had tried to talk him out of finishing at first. Derek had told him he was going to finish. So Jim said they would do it together. And they did. They crossed the line together. Derek was crying. The stadium was on its feet. But Derek barely noticed. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the cameras. He was thinking about the race he had just lost. It was only after he left the stadium, after receiving treatment, that he began to understand what had happened around him. The press was waiting. By the time Derek left the stadium, the world had already seen something he hadn't had the chance to understand.
The cameras eventually moved on.
Derek didn't. After Barcelona, there were more operations. 8 or 9 of them by his own account. But none of them brought him back to the track. 2 years after the Olympics, a surgeon told him he would never run again or represent his country in sport. For a man who had spent most of his life becoming an athlete, there was no easy way to hear that. Derek later described what followed as a period of anger. For about 2 years, he was angry with the sport. And underneath the anger was something harder to name. The life he had worked toward was gone. Not postponed, not waiting for another rehabilitation program. Gone. Derek later described the feeling as though there had been a death. For 2 years, Derek was angry. Then, one day, he decided to get on with his life. Nothing about Barcelona had been undone. His Olympic dream was still gone. His athletics career was still over. But Derek had reached a decision. Moving forward would not begin with another medal. It would begin with accepting that the old race was finished and deciding to enter another. The next chapter did not begin on another running track. Derek had played basketball as a schoolboy. Now he started again. Basketball could not give him back the Olympics. It could not return him to the 400 meters. But it offered another challenge. And Derek liked challenges. He began working his way through the ranks. One level became another, until eventually, the man who had once represented Britain on the running track was representing England on a basketball court. He had not recovered his old career. He had built something different. But starting again meant starting again. Derek was no longer the 400-meter runner everyone knew. He was learning a different game. Different movements, different demands, different ways to compete. There was no shortcut back to the athlete he had been. He had to become a different kind of competitor. And that meant accepting the humility of beginning again. Not at the level he had once known, but wherever the new road began. There was still one thing Derek could not quite leave behind. The surgeon had told him that he would never represent his country in sport again. Derek eventually did. And when he reached the England team, he sent the surgeon a signed photograph of the team. It wasn't the reason he had started again. Derek has explained that he loved other sports and simply liked challenges. But there was a point to be made. Someone had predicted the limits of his becoming. Derek had discovered that the prediction did not have to become his own. And perhaps that was the first thing Derek began to understand. He didn't need to find another version of the life he had lost. He could build a different one. Basketball was not the replacement for the 400 meters. It was simply another place where he could compete. And when that chapter opened, it did not become the last one. There were more. Rugby, kickboxing, motorcycle racing, boxing. Different arenas, different demands, different versions of the athlete. Derek kept stepping into them. Not because each one was going to restore what Barcelona had taken, but because the part of him that still wanted to learn, compete, and test himself had survived the loss. The sport changed. The becoming didn't stop. Years after Barcelona, Derek would look back at the life he had built and admit something that might have surprised the younger man on that Olympic track. he still wondered what might have happened if that hamstring had held. Perhaps he would have become an Olympic medalist. Perhaps his career would have taken him somewhere else entirely. He would never know. But he also said something else. He loved the life he had. That is the part worth staying with. Because accepting that one future is gone does not require pretending you never wanted it. Derek did not have to rewrite Barcelona. He did not have to convince himself that the injury was somehow a blessing. He simply built a life that the injury had not been allowed to finish. Maybe that is where Derek's story becomes bigger than sport. Because there are people who are not grieving something they never had. They are grieving something they were already becoming. A career they had spent years preparing for. A family they thought they would have. A body they trusted. A future that once felt so close they could almost see themselves living inside it. And then something happened. An injury. A failure. A decision that could not be undone. A door that closed before they were ready to leave that room. Derek's story does not tell us that the future we lost was never important. It tells us something harder. Sometimes the future we prepared for really does disappear. And when it does, becoming does not end with it. There may be a version of your life you will never get to live. But that does not mean there is no life left for you to become. Maybe you are standing somewhere Derek once stood. Not on an Olympic track. Not in front of 65,000 people. Maybe you're somewhere much quieter. Sitting alone with the wreckage of a future you had already begun to live in your mind. You know what you were supposed to become. You remember the years you gave to it. You remember the version of yourself you were becoming before something changed. And perhaps the hardest part isn't losing what you had. It's losing the person you thought you were going to be. Derek's story doesn't tell you that the old future will return. It doesn't tell you that what happened was somehow meant to happen. It tells you something quieter. A future can end, and becoming can continue. The old race can be finished, and there can still be another one. Not the race you planned, not the life you imagined, the one you choose to enter now. Because sometimes, the forge does not give you back the person you were becoming. Sometimes, it teaches you how to become without them. Until our next story, this is the power of pain, where broken stories become unbreakable strength. Thank you for watching.